Random House Audio presents The Twilight of the Bombs, Recent Challenges, New Dangers, and the Prospects for a World Without Nuclear Weapons, by Richard Rhodes. Read for you by Robertson Dean. The problem of nuclear weapons is nuclear weapons. Richard Butler. Prologue. A Different Country. It did not take atomic weapons to make war terrible. It did not take atomic weapons to make man want peace, a peace that would last. But the atomic bomb was the turn of the screw. It has made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us up those last few steps to the mountain pass, and beyond, there is a different country. Robert Oppenheimer, 1946. When the ice broke on the river of history in the final years of the Cold War, the world had lived with nuclear weapons for almost half a century. 40 nations had attained the capability to build them, but only 9 had yet done so: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and South Africa. Together, these 9 nations had accumulated about 60,000 nuclear weapons, about 3,000 pounds of explosive force for every man, woman, and child on Earth, more than enough to destroy the human world. Their reasons for going nuclear varied, from the United States' conviction that only nuclear weapons could protect the West from a communist empire it believed to be bent on world domination, to the Soviet Union's belief that it stood surrounded by enemies and alone in a hostile world, to France's and Britain's doubts that the United States would make itself a nuclear target to come to their aid, to South Africa's curious notion that brandishing a small nuclear arsenal, should it be attacked by other African states, would compel the major nuclear powers to intervene on its behalf. Yet in all the years since the first 2 atomic bombs destroyed the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War, no more nuclear weapons had been exploded in anger. Those who believed in deterrence, in the power of the bombs to prevent their use, naturally believed that half a century free from major war meant that deterrence had worked, and by extension should continue to work in perpetuity. Those who doubted the efficacy of deterrence noted that both the United States and the Soviet Union had accepted stalemate, as in Korea, or even defeat, as in Vietnam and Afghanistan, rather than risk nuclear escalation. Nuclear arsenals might promote caution in relations among hostile states, the doubters therefore argued, but they clearly did not compel, while a world awash with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons gravely risked accidental or inadvertent nuclear holocaust. During the Cold War, most of the nations of the world had aligned themselves with one or the other superpower, freezing into place the contending hegemonies that had followed from the victories and defeats of the Second World War. With the warming of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, initiated by the Soviet reformer Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s, that seizure of international relations began to release. At a summit meeting between Gorbachev and the U.S. President Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik, Iceland in 1986, the 2 leaders had come close to agreeing to lead the world to the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. To that purpose, Gorbachev had championed common security, a principle formulated out of Europe's Cold War experience of zero-sum division between East and West. As the United Nations Commission chaired by the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme had defined it in a 1982 report, the principle of common security asserts that countries can only find security in cooperation with their competitors, not against them. In a speech to the 27th Soviet Communist Party Conference early in 1986, Gorbachev had applied the principle to the ongoing nuclear arms race between the Cold War antagonists. The task of ensuring security, he told the delegates, is more and more taking the form of a political task, and can be resolved only by political means. In our time, genuine equal security is guaranteed not by the highest possible, but by the lowest possible level of strategic balance, from which it is essential to exclude entirely nuclear and other types of weapons of mass destruction. Reagan, however, believed that only physical security in the form of space-based anti-missile defenses could guarantee nuclear disarmament. The Soviet government was not prepared to undertake such an expensive and ultimately chimerical technological competition, and the agreement on nuclear elimination failed. Reykjavik was not fruitless, however. It put both sides' commitment to nuclear arms reductions, rather than merely arms control, firmly on the table, and led directly to the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of particularly destabilizing nuclear weapons carried on 2,692 U.S. and Soviet medium-range missiles. Despite their seemingly implacable differences, the two superpowers had worked both separately and jointly during the Cold War to limit nuclear proliferation, implicitly cooperating for common security. Their most significant cooperation drove the negotiation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, opened for signature in 1968, which offered extensive security guarantees and the advantages of commercial nuclear power to countries willing to forgo acquiring nuclear arsenals. By 1990, 140 states had signed on. More than any other factor, the NPT had limited the proliferation of nuclear weapons across the world. Actions had also been directed against specific states. In 1975, a threat by the United States to withdraw its military forces from the Korean Peninsula had compelled South Korea to abandon its program of nuclear weapons development. In 1976 and again in 1987, partly under pressure from the People's Republic of China, the United States had forced Taiwan to abandon clandestine nuclear weapons programs. Satellite images indicating an impending South African nuclear test that the Soviet Union passed to the United States for timely action in 1977 led to intense U.S. diplomatic pressure that delayed the South African nuclear weapons program by several years. But the very predominance in nuclear weapons that the two superpowers had achieved had worked against their security. Neither side had been sufficiently confident of the authority of its nuclear arsenal to limit itself to minimum deterrence, as China had done, and both the Soviet and American military-industrial complexes had taken advantage of that uncertainty to repeatedly expand and modernize their nation's nuclear arsenals. Actions that were justified domestically as defensive were perceived by the other side to be hostile. In 1983, shaken by the Reagan administration's belligerent military buildup and misjudging the intent of a major NATO field exercise in West Germany called Able Archer, which included a practice run-up to nuclear war, the Soviet leadership under Yuri Andropov had very nearly launched a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States. Though it all but escaped public notice, the Able Archer incident was the Cuban Missile Crisis of its day. By the time Gorbachev came to power in 1985, both sides threatened each other with total and mutual annihilation. If one country keeps building weapons while the other one doesn't do a thing, Gorbachev told Richard Nixon in the summer of 1986, the one that arms will not gain anything from it. The weaker party could just explode its nuclear stockpile, even on its own territory, which would mean suicide for it and a slow death for the opponent. The progress at Reykjavik and the arms proposals that Gorbachev offered in its aftermath foundered on American suspicions of Soviet intentions, but gradually, during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, through the good offices of Secretary of State James A. Baker III and the Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, relations began to warm. That improvement prepared the way for cooperation between the two former enemies to beat back the aggression of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, who misread the Reagan and Bush administration's tilt toward his country and against its enemy Iran as licensed to plunder Kuwait and threaten Saudi Arabia, a prime U.S. client. By the time the Persian Gulf War ended in February 1991, however, the struggle for power in the Soviet Union was straining Gorbachev's control, and the Soviet economy was collapsing. After a coup attempt against the beleaguered Soviet leader the following August, U.S. policy shifted from support to salvage. When the Soviet Union fractured into 15 independent nations on 25 December 1991, one nuclear power suddenly metastasized into 4: Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, each with substantial nuclear arsenals. Thereafter, the United States scrambled to support the consolidation of the former superpower's nuclear weapons on Russian soil to subsidize the scientists and engineers of the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?